Hi there, my name is Fran Sepler. I'm president of Sepler and Associates. For about 30 years, I have been working with organizations to both respond to and to prevent misconduct, but more importantly and more relevant to our discussion today, to really come to understand how to create the kind of vibrant, safe, respectful cultures that foster creativity, that foster problem solving, that foster learning, and ultimately make for organizations that are high performing. In our discussion today, I'll be presenting you with some what I think is pretty important information. And to be clear, this is not an anti-harassment or anti-bullying training. We're going to spend a lot more time today on what we should be doing right rather than what goes wrong. But I am going to talk about some different kinds of problematic behavior that when you go to attend your institution's anti-harassment or anti-bullying policy probably don't get talked about, but they're much more common and much more insidious. This is an interactive session, and I will be giving you an opportunity to participate in a number of ways. Just as far as in the run of the program, when I'm speaking, I encourage you to use the raise hand icon so I can know that there's somebody with a question. I also encourage you to put questions in the chat. We have folks who are monitoring that. If I don't catch it, they can sort of tap me on the shoulder and let me know that you've got something to say. And as of right now, we're a teeny tiny enough group that any one of you could just take yourself off mute, clear your throat, and say, hey, Fran, I've got a question. And that would not cause me to break stride at all. So feel free to do that. I'm going to put my screen up now, and I'm going to introduce a tool that maybe you're familiar with and maybe you're not, for us to be able to do some interactive work here today, and that is to use the annotation tool in Zoom. And what annotation is, if you look at the top of your screen and it says you are viewing Fran's screen or Fran Sepler's screen, there should be another a button that says View Options. If you click on that, you'll have a toolbar. And on that toolbar, one of the options is Annotate. When it is, depending on who's looking at it, it's either a pencil or a caret. So when you do that, you're going to see that there's a whole bunch of options under Annotate. The one I want to direct you to is the fifth from the left, and it's called Stamp. And it gives you the option of stamping this slide with a number of different symbols. When you click on the stamp and then you click on the slide, it will show up. And if I've done things right, it will be anonymous. So you can express yourself candidly without anybody being able to trace it back to you. So in order to practice this and make you expert in annotating before we use it for official purposes, I put up this handy dandy little example where I'm going to ask you to place a stamp on your favorite season. Controversial, I know. So go ahead, and if you have a question about how to use the annotation, feel free to ask. If you want to experiment, nobody's going to feel as though you're ballot box stuffing if you put a couple of stamps in just to do it. This is where you can be a little bit playful and try different things. And as is usual, winter does not get much love. And we have a pretty nice distribution amongst the other seasons. So you've now become an expert in using the annotation tool. As we go on, I'm going to ask that you be careful, because we'll be using this as a polling tool, that you be careful to use only one stamp per slide going forward. So I'm going to clear that out, and I'm going to move us ahead, and you'll see the annotation function come back in just a little while. So let's get centered and let's focus on work. I want you to think about a time you've been away work. And I know that for many of us working from home or working remotely somehow, this is not the same sort of mind exercise that it might have been a year and a half or 2 years ago, but maybe it's just the time when you finally close your computer after teaching online or a whole day, or maybe you are back in your IRL physical workspace and you've gotten to actually take a vacation. Or maybe it's just a weekend, or maybe you've taken a mental health day. Maybe you've been away from work to attend to personal matters. I want you to think about the moment where you are returning to work. It's time to go back to work. And for many of us, that requires a mental adjustment. It calls upon us to sort of change and recalibrate our thinking, our emotions, maybe even our physical energy. When we're on a weekend or a vacation, we get to decide our own priorities. We get to choose where to invest our time and energy. The choices we make are ours, or they're collective with our family or friends or whoever else we're sharing our lives with. But we get to do a lot more of what we want. And I know for me, when I take a vacation, I always schedule a buffer day before I go back to work, because the adjustment for me after a week of vacation can be really profound. But then the moment has come and you get off your bike or out of the train or out of your car, or you walk across your apartment and you open your computer and you are having what I refer to as a door handle moment, that moment where all of your preparation has either worked or not worked, but you're here, you're back at work and you're about to open that door or open that computer or log on or do whatever it is that symbolizes for you the beginning of being at work. Now, what we know is that everybody's door handle moment is going to be different. For some of us, the very lucky, some of us, that moment where we return to work is a pretty good one. We love what we do. We like our time away, but we love what we do. We feel great about the people we work with. We feel stimulated and excited by the substantive work we do, the creative work we do, whatever our role is. We view work as something that is a plus in our lives. We feel as though our talents and skills and contributions are valued, and we're good. We're good. We're ready to go to work. And now let's move down that continuum from those very lucky people who have a great alignment between their purpose and their work and what they want and need and what they're getting. And let's move to sort of the middle of the scale, where you have folks who are meh. They're not thrilled to be at work, but nor are they miserable to be at work. They tell themselves, you know, if I'm going to have a job, it might as well be this one, and it's work. It's not supposed to be all roses. So some of what I deal with is a slog, and some of the people I deal with, not so great. But on the whole, you know, I have more positive than negative, and I feel as though while some of my work is maybe not rewarding, some of it is, and some of the people I work with are really great. And, you know, I work to live. I don't live to work. And I'm going to show up and I'm going to do what I need to do so that I can continue to get the remunerative rewards of my workplace and continue to live my life the way I want to. And now if we go all the way to the furthest continuum, let's think about that person whose door handle moment is a nightmare. The person who knows with certainty that as soon as they walk into the workplace, it's going to start again. That there are either individuals who are targeting them or shunning them or in some way treating them in a manner that creates for them fear or a sense of harm, that they don't feel valued. They feel as though they are constantly trying not to make mistakes or trying to avoid upsetting someone or trying to make themselves invisible so they're not targeted. And they started worrying about their door handle last night. Their stomach started to hurt, their head started to hurt. They had what we call anticipatory anxiety. And by the time they walk into work on a Monday morning or whatever their Monday happens to be, they're already in a state of extremely high stress and fear. And for these folks, they just want to make it through the week. That's their goal. They need their job. They need to figure out how to survive it, but that's all they want to do, is to survive it. So, you know, we all have our own door handle moment, and we probably recognize where we are on that journey. And the fact is that at that moment, when we are reckoning with coming into our workplace and reckoning with the culture as we experience it, it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. Because if we love our work and we know we're valued and important, we show up like we're valued and important. We show up and we're engaged, and we invest, and we take risks, and we make choices, and we relate to people, and we find energy in what we're doing. And so we look like a pretty good contributor in that workplace. And if we're showing up just to check the boxes and get it done, folks don't have ill will towards us, but we're really not viewed as somebody that people seek out or strive to be around. Maybe people feel as though their energy gets a little sapped in dealing with that, so they may not collaborate quite as much. And they're viewed as adequate performers by the people who evaluate them. And that person who's having a really, really tough time at work, when you come to work and your entire agenda is to survive, you're probably not performing or showing up for your colleagues in a stellar way. And there's something that happens when we come into the workplace and we're full of fear, and that is that people start seeking distance from us, and so we get isolated, and that redoubles our sense that we're not safety. So that door handle moment is something really to assess. And I'm just going to ask you, and I know we're a really small group, but you are anonymous. I'm going to ask you to go back to that annotation toolbar, and let's see how you're all doing. And this is, part of this is to see it sort of for me to level set on how you all feel about your workplaces, for you to see whether there is a wide spread for people, and for you to think about and actually call out for yourself what your door handle moment is, because nobody's probably asked you this question before. So I'll give you just a moment, and you can place a stamp. Okay. And I thank you for those of you who are doing that. And for those who choose not to, that's absolutely fine. So we have folks skewing to the positive, which is great. And so what we're going to be talking about for you is the things that can make your experience go from a 5 to a 4, a 4 to 3, a 3 to a 2, and enhance that experience. Oh, I forgot to clear them. Hang on. Here we go. So when we talk about what makes up people's door handle moments, I've coined, because us consultants always like to have little sort of memorable phrases and anagrams and things like that. I just absolutely lost the word of what this is, but we talk about basic workplace dynamics. And when we talk about basic workplace dynamics, we're talking about 5 things that people assess and scan when they're deciding how they feel about their workplace. The first is your capacity to set and maintain boundaries. And we've all probably used the term boundaries in one respect or another, but let me just remind us that we all have physical boundaries. Those are boundaries around touch and proxemics, and whether we need to work in a private setting or prefer to work in a private setting or shared space. So that's sort of very, very fundamental. Psychological boundaries. What are we willing to share about our thought processes with others, with the why? Sorry, with the why of our decisions. How interested are we in talking about our mental health and what goes into our mental health? How much do we want people being curious, expressing curiosity about that? Emotional boundaries. How much do we want people to share their feelings with us, and how willing are we to share our feelings with them, including the basis for our emotions? Sexual boundaries go to the comfort we might have with someone expressing sexual interest in us in the workplace, or engaging in sexual banter or conversation. Now, most of our organizations have pretty firm policies around this, but as somebody who's been a workplace investigator for 30 years, I'm going to tell you that these are boundaries that people set every day in their workplace. Boundaries on time. When does your workday begin and end? How much can your employer ask for you, or your colleagues ask of you in terms of your time? When is it a boundary violation to have somebody assuming that you always have time for them or monopolizing you? And then material boundaries, the boundaries around our stuff. What are we willing to share, and what is our things that we feel proprietary towards, whether that's our intellectual property, our creative work, our office supplies. Number 2 is affirmation. In addition to feeling as though we can or can't set healthy boundaries for ourselves and maintain them, do we feel as though in our workplace we receive sufficient recognition and reward? Are we seen for our contributions? Do we feel that we're being adequately either compensated or adequately rewarded in non-financial ways for what we're doing? Reward can be intrinsic, reward can be satisfaction, but here we're talking about things that are coming from others. The third thing that goes into our sense of a healthy workplace is safety. Do we feel physically safe, and do we feel psychologically safe? And we're going to talk about psychological safety in just a moment or two. And then identity. Do we feel as though we are inclusive of who we are? Do we feel as though we do not have to hide parts of ourselves, disguise parts of ourselves, put a mask on in the workplace? Do we feel that we are appreciated and understood as an individual rather than lumped into the kind of you people, those people, things that can happen? And that you people, those people doesn't just happen around diversity dimensions. It can happen from people looking at and saying, you people in management, or you people, you donors, and being sort of lumped in with a group for better or worse. Do I feel comfort and warmth in my workplace? And so, warmth is part of connection. We know that perceptions of warmth and that people around us have an interest in us, and that we take an interest in other people in a well-bounded way, is part of that overall calculation of whether we view our workplace as good, healthy, positive, and a plus in our lives, as a neutral in our lives, or a negative. So I talked about psychological safety, and I want to drill down on that a little bit with you, because over the last 10 years, the importance of psychological safety in the workplace, which has always been important, but the recognition of how deep and profound it is as a concept has really taken root. And Amy Edmondson is sort of the grandmother, I guess, of psychological safety. She's at Harvard Business School, and she has for years been talking about the importance of having an environment in which people feel that they can take interpersonal risks. And she studies this on a team level. Her work really got spotlighted when Google began to look at why some of their teams were performing at a really high level and why some weren't. And, you know, Google is one of those organizations that has the resources to apply science to their actual organization. So they hired a passel of social scientists to come in and study their teams. And the team, you know, they found a number of correlates to high performing teams. As you can imagine, diversity and leadership were important, but they found that the most salient thing that was present in every one of Google's high performing teams was this sense of psychological safety, that people could take risks, that their voice was heard, that they could say things that challenged other people, that they could take risks, and that they didn't worry about it before, during, or afterwards. So there's been a ton of research into psychological safety and its existence or non-existence. And there are three particular places that psychological safety benefits our individual work experience and benefits organizations. Number one, it is consistently shown across something like 700 different studies to show that when people feel psychologically safe, they step up and they perform at a higher level. This is really simple and logical when you think about the fact that if you are taking risks, if you are willing to speak, if you are willing to try something new, if you're not afraid of making mistakes, then you're going to be involved in more experimentation. And experimentation is fundamental to learning, which gets us to our next benefit, that when individuals are able to acknowledge mistakes, are willing to experience failures as part of a growth mindset and support others in doing so as well, the organization accelerates learning, individuals accelerate their learning, their development, and their growth. And this turns out to have a big impact on two particular areas, creativity and problem solving. And finally, at a human level, we want organizations where people aren't afraid to have a voice, whether that is questioning something that you think requires questioning because a premise or an assumption appears to be erroneous, or it is about throwing out an opinion that may not be the status quo and may not match other people's opinions because you see the world in a different way because of your identity, or because you're neurodivergent, or because you spend your life walking to a different drummer, that lack of conformity and participating from there is valued in the organization. We want people speaking up because we know that when people see other things happening that shouldn't be happening, we get early warning systems and we're able to fix things before they become big problems. We want people to be able to step up, to be active bystanders when they see somebody else struggling, whether that's struggling with interpersonal misconduct or struggling with the organizational dynamics, to be able to say, what can I do to help? And to be able to provide that kind of support. And we want people to seek help when they need it. Psychological safety allows people to do that. In the absence of psychological safety, we have fear. And the sad thing in the social science body of work out there is that fear is considered to be normative in organizations. It's like someone a long time ago said, well, of course people are going to be afraid at work, and just sort of started studying all the forms fear takes in the workplace. I personally have dedicated my fear to trying to eradicate or find ways to reduce fear. But the fears they tell you that you naturally have in the workplace derive primarily, I believe, from hierarchy. This is a fear that if you name a problem, that you're going to be seen as the problem or blamed for it. You're going to be seen as inadequate if you point out a problem without having a solution. And I don't know that very many of the people on this call work in corporate America, but this is a biggie in corporate America. You have all of these high-level people saying, don't come to me with a problem unless you can solve it. Well, what if I am an accountant, but I see a serious problem based on the data I have in the way staffing is working somewhere? I don't know anything about staffing. How do I surface that? I need to be able to say something's wrong over there. and not have a solution, of being seen as going over your leader's head, hierarchy, of looking ignorant, incompetent, negative, or disruptive, of being punished or retaliated against for naming the problem, and of course, fear of losing your job, derailing your career. And these are real fears. So these are the things that psychological safety starts to tamp down. So what happens when we come to work and fear happens? Well, number one, we're not naming problems. We're not reporting errors. And therefore, those problems snowball. I just was working with a law firm this week where I had virtually 3/4 of the associates with under 2 years experience say to me, I will never report a mistake I make because I'm afraid that I'm going to be labeled as a terrible lawyer. Well, you can believe that when these folks are working on litigation matters, that 6 months from now, that case is going to move into the next stage of litigation, and somebody's going to howl that this terrible mistake was made and never reported. And instead, it's going to have snowballed into a major procedural problem. People spend a lot of time and energy on workarounds. I see this in higher education all the time, that everybody is afraid to name that a process that isn't working has never worked. And instead, everybody learns to work around it. And they spend a lot of time and energy rather than naming the problem, because they have all those fears that if they name the problem, they're going to be punished, they're going to be named. And you know, fear has a powerful effect on mammals. When we are in fear, our brain is very, very busy secreting chemicals like cortisol that cause us to, and which have a neurotoxic effect. They reduce our ability to be creative, they reduce our ability to solve problems, and they're contagious. And our behavior when we're in fear results in us either fighting and acting up, or being aggressive towards other people, or throwing people under the bus, or fleeing. We start spending a lot of time looking for another job, or we freeze. We just do nothing and turn into that person whose door handle moment is just getting through the week. And so we end up either leaving, acting up, or failing to perform. So this is a self-test here. I am not going to call anyone out on this, I promise. This is just for you to answer silently for yourself. There are many, many, many sophisticated ways to measure psychological safety in a team and in an organization. But Amy Edmondson, when she first started naming this, identified these simple questions as a way to identify team psychological safety. So what we do is we ask every member of a department or a team, or however we define it, each of these questions to answer silently for themselves. And then we take the opportunity to talk about the answers if it is psychologically safe enough to do it. So this is an opportunity for you to measure your own psychological safety. I'll read through them rather quickly, and I will make my slides available for those of you who want to have more time to reflect. Number one, if you make a mistake on this team, it is often held against you. Number two, members of this team are able to bring up problems and tough issues. And by the way, this is a Likert scale, so it's completely agree, somewhat disagree, or completely disagree. People on this team sometimes reject others for being different. It is safe to take a risk on this team. It is difficult to ask other members of this team for help. No one on this team would deliberately act in a way that undermines my efforts. Working with members of this team, my unique skills and talents are valued and utilized. So when we do this as a team exercise, and some teams like to do it in writing, and we collect that data back, there are two things I look for. Obviously, how positively people answer these questions is a general indicator of the climate of the team. But we also look to see if there are outliers. If you have a team where the majority of people answer positively, but there's a significant number who answer negatively, that's a dynamic of marginalization and actually represents a much less safe team than when everybody answers in a more neutral or even slightly negative way, because it means at least everybody's experiencing the same thing instead of that people are being excluded or placed on the margins. So by answering those questions, you should have a pretty good measure, not only of where you sit with your team, but maybe some things that if you have the opportunity to go back to your team and say, you know, we could work on some things, have some ideas of what those areas might be. So you know that in a psychologically safe environment, you're not afraid to be yourself, to make mistakes, to ask questions, to raise problems, to disagree, or to take risks. And I will add, because there's often a contrarian listening to me, that we do all these things respectfully. We do these non-disruptively, we do these productively. So this isn't being psychologically safe doesn't mean throwing a shoe into the middle of a conversation. It means being authentic participant in that conversation and feeling safe to bring your perspective to it. So there are 5 specific steps that teams can take to increase their psychological safety. And I try and keep these really simple because they're easy to introduce into any team, whether it's your book club, your intact work team, whether it's a cross-functional team, whether it's a committee. And the first is making explicit, inclusive team norms. So these might involve how people have voice. One of the things that has been found is that in psychologically safe teams, that over time, everybody contributes at an equal measure. That doesn't mean that in one meeting where we're talking about something where you're a subject matter expert, that everybody's going to have the same amount to say. But it means that if I were to look at your discussions over a 5-month period, we'd find that everyone spoke at about the same level. So sometimes teams implement norms such as nobody speaks until everybody's had a chance to speak, so that each person is given an opportunity to speak before people will speak for the second time. I work with a big national nonprofit that has a really interesting norm for their meetings where there are multiple levels of hierarchy present, which is that no one is permitted to speak for more than 3 minutes consecutively. Because what they found was that when the people at the top of the hierarchy kicked off meetings and talked, they talked far more than they needed to. And the more they talked, the less other people were willing to talk. They found when they could create incisive, clear communication, and they became, as part of the norm, that when they finished speaking, saying, so what do you have to say, or I'd like to hear from some of you, that participation increased tremendously. They also found that diversity of participation increased tremendously. Taking time for social warming. I think that in the days of Zoom, I think we've all gotten a little tired of let's do an icebreaker and share, what our favorite color is. And people will roll their eyes at those. But I think that those are awkward attempts at what we're trying to accomplish, which is the things that used to happen when we all got together in a conference room. And I would ask how your vacation was, and you'd ask how my kid's game was, or I'd noticed that you had a new sweater and I'd ask you about that. That's called social warming. It's it's an important part, and it's part of that connection in basic. And if we are not wasting time, and we are not being frivolous when we take the time for that social warming. If it's not happening naturally in situ, then we need to find ways for it to happen. So we can find meaningful ways to do that, such as, we've been at this working virtually for about a year. Let's take a minute and just go around and have each person say, what's one thing you've learned in the last year that you feel has been helpful to you? Or what's one thing that's happened in the last year that's really had an effect on you? Those sorts of substantive icebreakers, bring people closer. And of course, we always want to make sure they're well-bounded questions because of boundaries. Encourage and support help seeking. Always be willing to say to somebody, what can I do to help? When we use that kind of language, we give people permission to seek help. And we encourage help seeking by when somebody does seek help from us, whether it's on a routine matter or something very significant, we always thank them for doing so. Those little cues tell people that that behavior is valued. Already talked about the importance of a growth mindset regarding errors or failures. You don't learn to ride a bike by never falling down, and you don't learn to do the kind of creative work you folks do without, I'm sure, some experimentation and failure, and that is part of the process. And finally, seeking and embracing feedback. This is the #1 least developed skill in the American workplace, is the ability to see feedback as a daily process, to provide constructive, helpful feedback, and to accept feedback without defaulting to defensiveness or fear. And I just want to talk about, as we're all going back into physical work, and some of us are working hybrid and we're dealing maybe with clients differently. I think that in our organizations, for those of you who work in organizations, we have to recognize that work-life issues have changed, and we need to be able to talk about that. We need to talk about the fact that we have people with health demands in our lives that we need to attend to. We need to recognize that as our kids' schools might have online periods because of COVID, that our child care needs may change. We may have, everything as simple as we have adopted a pet during that at-home time, and we've never actually gone to work and had to manage that, and we may need to have a transition period. We need to feel safe sharing aspects of our situations that are relevant to our scheduling or location. And people need to know that being vulnerable that way and saying, I'm struggling, I've got something that I've got to balance, I may need an accommodation, is not a deficit to the team or a lack of commitment. So that's just a kind of timely warning. Finally, on psychological safety, let me be clear that being psychologically safe is not the same as being comfortable. When you're working on a really safe team or with a really safe department, there's a lot of cognitive friction. People give tough feedback. There's respectful but vigorous disagreement. There's assumptions challenged. There's tough questions being given. People point out weak spots in other people's work because they want them to be better. And that shared purpose of wanting someone to be better and aspiring with them towards excellence is heard, understood, and felt by the other folks. When you're not afraid that it's going to result in harm, you are willing to get really uncomfortable, walk to that edge of fear, but recognize that the other folks have your back. So, next poll question. I feel my workplace is psychologically safe. And again, you are anonymous when you do this, but it's your comfort level. I had envisioned 30 or 40 people, and it would be a lot more anonymity. But okay. So we've got kind of a split group here, and for those of you who are in a place where you're agreeing with it, that's really awesome. For those of you who are feeling in complete disagreement, some work to be done and some thinking about maybe how to start a conversation or start some processes that might move things a little more closely towards safety. So thank you for being willing to be vulnerable and share your view. And as you can see, even in a small group like this, we've got people who all have very different experiences and somewhat polarized experiences. So this next concept I want to talk about is respect. And this is my firm's work. I'm not Harvard Business School, but I have been looking at this for many years. And a number of years ago, we realized we needed to have a really easy way for organizations to gauge their health. And we settled on this thing called respect that everybody says they want and everybody seems to know and understand. And we started to go to organizations and ask every single person in the organization anonymously and confidentially 3 questions. And each of these questions had a forced yes or no response. Here are the 3. You can answer them silently for yourself. Remember, you have to say yes or no. Do I feel respected at work? Does my employer value me? Does my work matter? And then we would take all of those answers from the organization, and the first thing we would do is we would dump them all in one bucket, and we would just count the yeses and count the nos. And then we would go to the organization's key performance indicators, whatever those were, whether they had a strategic plan and we could say this is their objectives for the year, or whether they had financial goals, or whether they had development goals, or whatever the organization's metrics were for measuring their own success. We went and we looked at how that related to how many yeses they got. And over, we found a sweet spot. We found that organizations that had 75% of their answers or more being yes were in process of or accomplishing their goals. They were doing well. And when we found organizations that were lower than 65, we found that they were either struggling on key indicators or they were struggling with everything. And the further south of 75% they got, the more they were struggling. So this perception of respect, this perception that your work matters, the perception that you're valued, ties directly to organizational success, but more importantly, from where I sit in the portfolio I carry, it's the path to voice. So here's something you may not be aware of. The average length of time that somebody waits between the time they first feel bullied or harassed at work and the time they report it, the average length of time is 12 to 16 months. And they don't report it because they're afraid of all those things we talked about. I'm afraid I'll be retaliated against. I'm afraid I'll lose my job. I'm afraid I will be blamed. I'm afraid nothing will happen. I'm afraid that it'll only make things worse. And so when people feel respected, when people feel safe, they will speak, and they will speak sooner. And the remarkable thing that happens is that when I go to someone and I said, you know, so-and-so did this and it made me uncomfortable, that's a solvable problem. When I say, I thought that person was unduly harsh with so-and-so and somebody should talk to them, that's a great problem to have. The organization knows about it. It's at a stage where it's coachable and dealable with. When I come forward after 16 months and I say every day for the last year, this person has been cruel and harsh and bullying with me, and I'm at the point where I'm at the end of the rope, now we've got a massive amount of time and energy and angst and emotion and fear and risk that we're going to go through to solve that. Not that we shouldn't do it, we absolutely have to. But I'd sure rather solve a small problem when it's just starting than a big problem when it's become institutionalized. And if we get really good at creating safety and respect for people, the work environment becomes inclined to self-correct. Because I'm willing to say to you, you know, I wasn't really uncomfortable with that. Can we talk about it? Or I say to my team, can we take a moment and just reflect on where this conversation's going? Or may I share an observation about who's showing up in this meeting and who's being silenced? Those conversations, courageous conversations, can happen, and the organization becomes more self-correcting. So I'm a teacher. I like to give people tools. And so we get to think about, okay, how do we get people to yes? What is it that causes you to answer, yes, I feel respected? What is it that causes you to say, yes, I'm valued? And the fact is that we derive our answers to those questions by scanning and thinking about our work environment. So we are looking for cues. And those cues may be very unique to us, what we need, or they may be cues that we understand to in a general way signal that we are respected and valued. We look at what cues are normative in our environment. Do people show up and say good morning to each other? Do people seek out each other's ideas and opinions? Do people praise each other? Do people generally make sure to recognize good work? And so we look and see what's happening out there in the workplace, and then we sort of measure how much of that we're getting. And if we feel like we're getting a fair amount, an even amount, it's equitable and everybody is getting this, great. If we feel as though we're getting less than other people, not so great. And if we feel as though somebody who gave us respectful cues not very long ago has withdrawn them, that's problematic as well. And so by taking the temperature of our work climate every day, scanning the environment for threat is the way that a neuroscientist would talk about it. The same mechanism that caused us to scan the horizon for saber-toothed tigers when we were prehistoric causes us to walk into our workplace every day and say, okay, what's the texture of what's going on here? Some of us may have an easier time doing this, but we all do it in our own way. So this is where I'm going to turn it to you. I'm going to put you in quick breakout groups. And the question I want you to answer, and I'll put this in I'll broadcast this out to you, is just to identify what these cues are. What do people do and say in your work environment to demonstrate respect for each other? How do you show respect to the people you work with? How do the people you work for or who work for you demonstrate and show respect? What are the things you look for, both in a virtual and an in-person environment? Hi, everyone. So I thought we'd debrief. So I'd love to hear the kinds of things you came up with, and I'll ask for that each group's reporter present 1 or 2 items from your list, and then we'll go to the other group. And obviously, if the other group says something you had on your list, cross it out, and we'll just see if we can do some processing. So group 1, I think Mary, that was your group.
Okay, so we just have 4 things, but I think they're all loaded. So 1, to the question of how do we show respect, intentional listening and allowing others a time to speak. And I think that goes hand in hand with one of our last points, which is letting someone to speak to the end of their point without interruption. Asking for participation, making room for everyone to be a part of the conversation and to make a contribution. And hand in hand with the last one, intentionally not taking up too much space within a conversation or a group meeting.
As we say, take space and make space, right?
I like that.
Awesome. Great. And how about the other group? What did you have, similar things or additional things?
We definitely had at least the first 2 things that Mary mentioned, intentional or active listening, and kind of went hand in hand for us of making time for those interactions. Mm-hmm. We also added timely responses and responsive communication, or at least acknowledgement, because we were thinking about so many of our interactions being virtual. We mentioned repeating back what you've heard, which I think is a component of that active listening. And then being open to alternate ideas.
Great.
So, and then, and this also ties into that first group, be mindful of the space and time that you take up.
Mm-hmm.
which could be physical or it could be emotional space. And this definitely, conscious of who has or hasn't contributed, goes back to what Mary was saying about making sure all the group is engaged. And then the last one, just as we were coming back, was talking about be conscious of power levels. So sharing power, and we're actively working to equalize power dynamics within a group.
Great. Thank you very much. So this is a particularly sophisticated group. Sometimes we get simple things like, greeting people and acknowledging people as, a really fundamental. But the things that you describe are things we hear in every group, whether I'm dealing with public employees who maintain highways all the way through folks who run global organizations and everything in between. The thread of what we all want to feel and be respected is very similar. And Shonda, I wanted to comment on one of the ones that you identified, which is being responsive. There are a number of studies about virtual work that show that one of the most hazardous things that happens in virtual work is that we are left to interpret the meaning of silence. So that if I ask you for something, or I leave you a message, or I send you an email and I don't hear back, I tend to start telling myself stories. What have I done to upset Shonda? Does Shonda not think I'm as important as everybody else that Shonda has to deal with? Shonda just isn't being considerate or nice, and we tend to be sort of attributed to the person rather than maybe Shonda's got 700 fires that Shonda has to put out, or maybe Shonda's got a childcare issue, or maybe my email ended up in spam. So that we talk about those failures of shared knowledge. And so particularly in virtual space, being responsive, even to say, I can't respond to you right now, becomes particularly important. So thanks for that. I'm going to put my slides back up here. And I just thought I'd share with you kind of the most common answers that we get from having asked these questions thousands of times. Checking in with people. Again, in virtual space, we can't stick our head in somebody's office, so we need to deliberately seek out and check in. You talked about seeking people's ideas, having boundaries around communication, not sending people emails at, a text at 3 a.m, unless they've given you explicit permission to do that. Giving people credit, letting people make good choices and decisions where they're able to, being available to people. I think that goes to being responsive. Even simple things like please and thank you. Making sure that we use people's names and we pronounce them correctly. That goes to also identifying people's pronouns and using them correctly. Listening, being fully present, time, space, taking an interest in people, praising people, letting people finish their thoughts, apologies. And although there are many cultural comments we could make about it, smiling comes up a lot since we're all on screen, and it is sort of a unique thing that mammals can do. We can signal that we are not a threat to people by smiling at them. And I always want to make an exception for creepy Stephen King smiles, which are a threat, but these are the ones that come up. And, I've never had somebody say, well, I don't want that to happen to me. These are things we all hunger for and desire in our organizational life. And we can take inventory of how well we are bringing respect to our various interactions by taking a peek at this list and seeing what maybe we would add in addition. We talked about the fact that fear creates a negative brain response and causes us to have all these sort of not very nice chemicals swirling around our brain. But when we get these respectful cues, our brain does something decidedly different. It actually gives us a little squirt of serotonin and oxytocin. Those are calming, trust building, safety kinds of things that happen to us. And they make us feel more trustworthy, more open, and generally positive. And the thing about both negative brain response and positive brain response is it's contagious. That if we are getting cues that lead to us feeling trust, receptivity, and positivity, we are more inclined to give those cues to others and generate the same kind of response in them. And so it becomes part of climate. These are things that that become part of the tradition and the ritual of organizations, and people respond accordingly. So we can look at each discrete interaction we have, but the bigger question is, have we put these norms into our organization such a way that people know that this is what's expected of them and what they can expect from others? Finally, I think you aptly named hierarchy as a big factor and power and where it sits. There's something I call the magnifier. And I've had in my career so many discussions because I'm the one that gets called when someone is not behaving in the way they should and they need coaching, and I'm brought in to talk to them. And I have these folks, and I know some of you are university affiliated, so this will be familiar to you. I will have a university professor who's been having poor boundaries in their email communication with a student say, well, if they didn't like it, they just could have told me that they didn't like it. I'm really accessible. And I talk about the cloak of hierarchy, the cloak of power, and it's an invisible cloak. It's not like that robe you take out at graduation every year and you're like, here I am, I have a role in this thing. You're wearing it all the time, and your students see it even if you don't. And so what we have to recognize is that where we have some power, status, or authority at any level in an organization, people are experiencing how many cues they are getting or not getting from us in a much more powerful way than someone who is an equal or considered to not have power over them or power to affect them. So when my best friend doesn't say good morning to me one day, I'm going to say, what's going on? I bet they're having a bad day. I'll check in with them later. When a person who controls part of my destiny doesn't say good morning to me one day, I might cogitate and wonder what I've done. I might experience some fear or anxiety because of that magnifier. And so we need to be mindful of this, and that's part of being a good leader and wielding our status and authority with a sense of responsibility. And we also have to realize for any of us, if we're giving some people ample cues and other people not, they are noticing that, they are feeling it, and it's folding into their door handle moment, so to speak. Okay, so next poll question. I feel respected in my workplace. When you press on stamp, it's going to give you the option of a heart, a star, an X, a couple of other things. You just click on that, and then you click on the poll, and it will appear where you click on the poll. Fortunately, it seems like most of you are in a really good place in your employment, and maybe someone is feeling a little more challenged. So thank you for being willing to respond to that. I always think it's interesting to take the measure of a group. I'm going to talk about some subtle kinds of things that happen that derail respect and safety in a workplace. And the first one I want to talk about is disrespectful, uncivil, or rude behavior. Americans, we're funny about this. We often take pride in the fact that, we don't suffer fools well, or that I'm all business. I don't have time, to be touchy-feely, or, I'm good at what I do, and so I shouldn't have to worry about people's feelings. And there's been sort of a tacit acceptance in our culture that sometimes the cost of brilliance is rudeness or incivility. And as a result, a lot of our organizations have what I call that's just so-and-so problem. And that is when somebody says, well, that's just so-and-so. Their bark is worse than their bite. They really got a heart of gold. Or that's just so-and-so. They're a difficult personality, but they're very good at what they do. Or, well, you're just going to have to figure out how to work with them. They've been like that forever. And these are people who are persistently disrespectful, persistently uncivil, and particularly rude. And the fact is that people don't have difficult personalities. Organizations grow difficult personalities when they don't hold people responsible for both sides of the ledger, the substantive work and the treatment of people. And often people who are allowed to be rude and uncivil use that as a cudgel to carve out the things they want to do and don't want to do, or to get adversaries out of their way. And they're very polarizing. There's a researcher named Christine Porath who writes both for lay people and for academics, who has studied extensively the effect of rude and uncivil behavior in the workplace. And her research demonstrates persuasively, that even occasional instances of rudeness affect us profoundly. They take up our cognitive load. They reduce our ability to apply our cognition, therefore, to the tasks before us. And again, once again, just like a lack of psychological safety, affect creativity and affect problem solving. And so by saying that's just so-and-so and letting folks be rude and uncivil and not be held accountable, we are draining our organization of potential. This behavior, of course, is lawful. No one is going to necessarily be fired for an incident of rudeness. And in fact, to be honest, we probably all have days where we're not who we want to be and might snap at someone or be terse or short. There are no policies, because what if we had a policy that nobody could be rude? We'd all be walking on eggshells because we're all occasionally rude. What I'm talking about here is persistent rudeness, where rudeness is accepted, not as an exception. Oh, they must be having a bad day, I should check on them and ask what I can do to help them. But instead, everybody knows that person is going to be rude, dismissive. But that's toxic. It is a neurotoxin. It does reduce cognitive load. And it also, as I said about good behavior, it's contagious. So it is a culture killer. And one of the things I talk to organizations saying we want to have a good culture is the first thing I say is you need to eradicate permission for rude behavior. And sometimes that is very difficult because organizations have, if not condoned, they've excused or ignored that behavior for a very long time. And of course, we don't want to introduce civility codes. We want to instead help people understand how much better their behavior will work for them when they're treating people with respect. There's a myth that somebody who's a brilliant performer, a brilliant academic, a brilliant strategist, gets this unearned privilege of being rude and uncivil because their work is so good. But if you look at their body of contributions to the organization as a whole, they're not high performing. For every plus they're adding to the organization, there's a minus because they're ruining somebody else's day. They're shutting somebody else down. They're creating fear in someone else. So they're compromising other people's work quality. And ultimately, when you evaluate these folks, the loss side of the ledger is sometimes bigger than the plus side. I want to talk about some other kinds of misconduct that we fail to identify sometimes in organizations, even though we may have names for them. One that I come across a lot is boundary slippage. Now, I talked earlier about boundaries being part of our assessment as to whether our workplace is healthy, safe, and respectful. We talked about all the different kinds of boundaries that we need to maintain and keep. Well, occasionally, you're going to have somebody who just crashes across the boundary, somebody who stands way too close to you, somebody who tries to deconstruct your psychological boundaries by making completely inappropriate inquiries, somebody who touches you inappropriately. That's not boundary slippage. Those are frank boundary violations. They're not subtle. They need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed in a very productive way. But boundary slippage is something else. And this is a gradual and persistent erosion of our boundaries. And some of the most typical ways I see this, where individuals seek to get needs met from colleagues or reports beyond professional standards. I'll share with you a case I had not 8 months ago in which a person in a leadership role was going through a very difficult divorce. And she had an admin assigned to her, assigned to other people as well, but primarily to her. And she began to confide in her admin about many of the things that were going on in her marriage, and her decision to become sexually active, her decision to even though the divorce wasn't final, her decision to begin experimenting in different ways sexually. And she would say to this admin, "You're the only person who I have to confide in. You're the only person I can talk to who won't betray my confidences. If I didn't have you to talk to, I think I might kill myself." Now, that's a really extreme example, but it started out simply with, "Boy, I'm having a really tough time. So, if I don't get back to you," and started out as something really small, and it just got more and more and more intense. I had this with a young professional who was traveling with an older professional who began to share tales of his youth, and those tales got more and more and more private and explicit and problematic. And by the time the person realized that they weren't at all comfortable hearing this, they blamed themselves because they felt, "I should have said something earlier." Simple oversharing, using somebody's power, status, or authority to increasingly stretch boundaries under the guise of mentorship. So as a mentor, I might say, "Well, you and I should meet alone," or "You and I should go out after hours," or "Maybe you should come to my home for dinner," or, so the boundary of time, or the psychological boundary. "I really need to know all about you to understand you better, to be able to mentor you. Tell me about this." And I know that, especially in arts education, those boundaries can be really tricky because of the creative process. And I particularly have found this in folks who work in theater and other artistic places. So we see a lot of creeping boundary slippage there. Where you have a dual social and work relationship, where somebody exploits one to affect the other, to say, "You can't hold me accountable, you're my friend," or to say, "I'm not going to hold you to that standard because you're my friend." Or luring a person into increasingly unethical or inappropriate conduct and blaming them for the ensuing problems. So these are typical examples. And the reason I share this is because nobody talks about this, and it happens all the time. It sneaks up. It is gradual but persistent. And the person who's engaging in the boundary slippage may have rationalized that they're just trying to get to know the person better. They assume that it is unwelcome, but everybody who's on the receiving end of this reaches a point where the panic button gets hit. And by then, the momentum of the boundary slippage is pretty persistent, and how to stop it becomes a real concern. You're afraid of damaging the relationship. You're afraid of upsetting a person who may be presenting themselves as fragile or needy. You're worried about losing the mentoring. You're worried about appearing to be stodgy or prude-like. So these are things we need to watch for. And it's why we need to know and understand and enforce our boundaries at the outset. The other thing, and again, this word is used a lot, but people don't really take time to think about what it is. Every article I read about microaggressions, the examples they give are not microaggressions. Like saying to somebody of color, "Where are you from?" is not a microaggression. It's to me, it's an absolute sign of insensitivity that needs to be called out or called in or addressed. So the things that we find are verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities that communicate intentionally unlikely, inadvertently or incidentally more likely, hostile, derogatory, or negative slights. And the most common one I see is making someone invisible. simply not hearing someone when they speak, or not making space for someone to speak, or asking opinions of a particular group of people but not others, or getting data and disregarding the data that comes from the margins of the organization because only a few outliers brought that information forward. Minimizing social inequities, making statements like everybody can get ahead if they work hard enough, that, you know, if you make a good effort here, you have the same chance to succeed as everyone else, rather than recognizing that not everybody starts in the same starting block, and not everybody had the same training, and that some people are going to need a little more support, with the hope that they will blossom into exactly who they have the potential to be. Exceptionalism, treating somebody as though because they are particularly excellent, that they are exceptional rather, and they're the exception to the rule for their identity, for whether they represent an age or whether they have they're living with a disability, or whether they are somebody who is an immigrant, or somebody who is from a particular racial group. Othering, which is to have the norms be to constantly refer to us and we, when us and we isn't monolithic or uniform, and by using us and we too readily excludes or marginalizes folks, misnaming and misgendering, and then condescension masked as a concern. So these are some of the most common microaggressions that I'm coming across, that aren't somebody saying something obviously boneheaded or obviously bigoted, but when these things happen, and it can even involve things that are really hard to identify tangibly. Like, we know that if we were to videotape a series of meetings in any organization, that we could tell simply by virtue of eye contact and what I call giving face, which means looking at somebody when you're talking to them. We can spot the hierarchy in the group. The people who have the most power, status, and authority get full face and great eye contact. And the lower your importance in the group, the less eye contact you get and less face. So who can ever say, I got 0.5 nanoseconds less eye contact than that person, and therefore I feel less important? You can't say that, but over time, my experience as somebody who's getting less face and less eye contact is going to be a nagging sense that I'm not being paid attention to as much as others. So for ourselves, we need to be constantly vigilant of our own biases and fears so we can control for them. We know that the more we interact with diverse people, the less we're inclined to microaggress, because it does reduce implicit and explicit bias. Being exposed to differences reduces bias about those differences. Reducing our defensiveness, knowing that every single one of us carries a bag of implicit unconscious bias around with us, that it is not of our own making, it is not voluntary, it's just there because we are embedded in a culture that constantly bombards us with messages that cause us to have unknown stereotypes, biases, distorted thinking. And so when somebody pulls back an occluded vision and we're able to see clearly, our response, rather than that wasn't intentional, I didn't mean it, you misunderstand, should be thank you. And what I find for me is I ask myself the question, is it possible they're right? And then I remind myself to be curious. Help me understand. That's important for me to understand if that's what you're seeing. And this means that, that when someone tells us that they've hurt them, that we've hurt them, or that we've hurt someone else, we need to be open to hearing how we're showing up, and maybe exploring our own attitudes and biases. If you haven't taken implicit associations tests, an implicit associations test or one or more using the IAT, which you can go to by just Googling Project Implicit, I encourage you to do it. And then, of course, being an ally. If you are the target of boundary violations and microaggressions, a couple of tips. Speak from your values. What do you think is important and why is this a problem? Trust yourself. Don't try and talk yourself out of it. Don't try and talk yourself out of your feelings or your boundaries. And again, knowing what your boundaries are, knowing where professionalism stands for you, for instance, allows you to recognize boundary violations easily. Get some support or help. Decide if it's worth it to say something or do something. If this is somebody you're only going to deal with once and never do it again, do you want to do the emotional labor of trying to educate them? If this is somebody you deal with regularly, is it worth it? And remember that chronic boundary violations or repeated microaggressions are no longer subtle. These are things that you're going to need some support and help in dealing with. This is kind of a choose your own adventure. I have 2 case studies. One is on boundary slippage. One is on microaggressions. I'm going to put you again into two breakout groups, and each group you can choose which one you want to do. Boundary slippage is about putting you in the role where someone is encroaching on boundaries gradually, and microaggression involves participation in a staff meeting. I tried to make it very generic, where a microaggression takes place, and it gives you 3 prompts. So let me get a thumbs up to make sure that at least some of you were able to download this document from the chat. Great. And I'm going to put you into 2 groups, and I'm going to give you 10 minutes in your breakout groups. Hopefully they will come out a little more even this time. We should have 4 and 5, I think. And I'll call you back in 10 minutes and we'll discuss before we wrap up the session. You are officially
okay.
Group 1.
We are officially Group 1. Awesome. Take it. We took a while to decide which case study we wanted to do, actually, and we were trying to figure out maybe which one we would get the most out of discussing. So we chose the boundary slippage one because we recognize that happens in our field quite a bit, and even at our conferences is a space where boundary slippage happens really easily. And we only got to the first question, and the response that we had, we had kind of 2 possibilities of how to approach the first kind of step of boundary slippage. So this was the person starts sharing about the rough time and how we could lend support. And so one approach was like, if you didn't want it to go further, maybe this is how I'll summarize it. Like, if you didn't want it to go any further than the person sharing that story with you, might be something as simple as saying, thank you for sharing. I'm really glad that we have this professional relationship with one another, and that we can support each other in the work environment. And something like that kind of frames the relationship inside of work, so that the person hopefully gets cues like this isn't going to extend to a personal friendship. And then we also had a perspective, though, of thinking about what is shared, and it might be the first time that it's being shared, and trying to put it into the bigger picture. And whatever the concern is, maybe think about it, maybe look into it, try to learn something about it, and then approach it from a coaching standpoint. Like, could you help coach this person through whatever this challenge might be? So
Great. And I'm glad, it sounds like you had rich conversation, which is more important than getting all the way through the case study. But I think it is really challenging to both want to be a fellow human traveler with someone and supportive of them, and not to have them feel as though they're taking a risk with you as being tossed back in their face. And I really like that you put the frame around it of saying, I really value you as a colleague, and I really appreciate we can support each other as much as possible. And then maybe do some brainstorming. What resources do you have that you can call upon perhaps to help you with this? So it's sort of tacitly saying, I'm not one of them. And, I think we always want to thank people for taking the risk of sharing something in this case. And I would encourage you all to take this with you and sort of think through yourself. You can see that rather than getting that the clearer and clearer the violative nature of these interactions become, sometimes the harder it is to set the boundary because the sort of the precedent has been established. So again, knowing our boundaries up front allows us to say, this is something that's, that's already encroaching on what I'm comfortable with, and I need to set the boundary today while being kind, supportive, and empathetic. So thanks for that. Did the other group also pick this one, or did you do the microaggressions one?
We did the microaggressions one.
Okay. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so it was involving a new staff colleague that, suggested a new direction to go, and then a more senior person came in and said another one, and they only discussed that one. And our first question was, what should happen and who should make it happen? And we said, maybe previously a person in power would be kind of in charge of saying like, hey, wait a second, we need to acknowledge this other one. But now everyone really has a responsibility to take that on and just say, wait, pause. Let's kind of look at this as well and make sure everyone's heard. Consequences of this type of microaggression, continuing, basically giving power and permission to keep doing that action and repeating it. And then like you could kind of go with that person and say, hey, we need to, fix this, like a one-on-one respectful conversation about how it should go. And then justification or an excuse for it and how to counter it could be just like people got wrapped up in the conversation. We just kind of got carried away, and just to kind of say, like we said before, go back and acknowledge it. Even they could fix it then, say, let's go back and look at this one as well. And it could also happen if it's a group that's not used to kind of a shared governance kind of situation.
Allison, I just want to appreciate the work your group did in terms of both doing what groups do, which was immediately doing the analysis from hierarchy. When we do bystander intervention training, everybody looks to the person with the power in the room and says they should do something. But I really appreciated that you came in right behind that and said, but we've all got a responsibility here. And where the person in power might decide this is a learning opportunity, let's call this out, let's name it or call it in and stop our process and say, can we talk about what just happened here and do a little learning? Somebody with less status in the group might simply spotlight the person and say, I heard so-and-so say this, and I don't want us to lose that thread in the conversation. Or, can we go back to so-and-so? Could you repeat what you said earlier? Because I think both ideas are worthy of discussion. So from where we sit, we use different strategies and tactics. But it is a shared responsibility. And unfortunately, too often, the person who's in a position of greatest power is the person who's doing the microaggression. And so we need to find ways to, as allies and peers, without creating risk to our own safety, find ways to shift the process a little bit, or as you said, after the fact, perhaps provide some feedback. We want inclusive organizations, and we can only be inclusive when we are striving for safety and respect. If people aren't feeling safe, they don't feel included. If people don't feel respected, they're not part of the organization. And when that inclusion is authentic, learning can happen. People can begin to bring their differing perspectives to the table. People can talk about their errors and mistakes. People can push back on premises and assumptions. And when real learning is possible, we can contribute fully. So when we're safe to contribute and respected for our contributions, that's when culture change takes place. So the fundamental building blocks of culture is starting at the level where we have influence, bringing these things like shared norms, bringing the cues and behaviors that create safety, building in efforts, our own personal efforts to be mindful about these things, and then being an ally and an active bystander when we see things that are violations of boundaries, when people aren't getting affirmation, safety, identity, and connection. So with that said, I'm going to wrap up, and I'm going to ask you to give me one more piece of feedback here, and just let me know, and please be honest, how helpful you felt this session was. I am ironclad and always really appreciate candid feedback. So thank you all for your time, for your attention. This was a great group. You were all quality participants, so thank you so very much, and have a great evening.
Thank you,
Thank
Fran.
you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
That was amazing.